All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for being here with me today. I'm your host, Nolan. We got a lot to talk about today. We're going to, again, spend some time focusing on the latest in the Iran tensions, which continue to rise. We are looking at a potential U.S. intervention coming, maybe even in the coming days. So we got a lot to discuss there. Lots of developments yesterday. Donald Trump told the protesters in Iran that help is on its way. So we'll get into the implications of that announcement. And then also we're going to spend some time today, because I think it's important, discussing the backstory of how we actually got here. Because if you haven't been paying attention, this may seem completely out of context and completely out of nowhere, but it's important to actually discuss the timeline of events that led us to this potential U.S. intervention in Iran. So all that today and more on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
It is about who we are. It is about what we believe.
They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
The more you tell the truth, the stronger you become.
Mr. Speaker, we're not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic tonight. We're putting coal in the boiler and setting a course for the iceberg.
Maybe we should improve the liberty of our own country before we seek to do so abroad. Some of us have paid attention to the fact that the expert class, including the foreign policy experts, lie all the time. The correct answer to this, of course, as it always is liberty. All right, everybody, before we begin, if you wouldn't mind going right down below this video and hitting like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. Also, if you wouldn't mind going to my Instagram, X, and Spotify accounts and giving all those a follow, I'd really appreciate that as well. Let's get into the story of the day, which is, of course, the rising tensions in Iran, which seem to be leading to a potential U.S. intervention in Iran. So we'll start off with this Truth Social post that was put out yesterday at 9:43 a.m. by Donald Trump. It says, quote, "Iranian patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions, save the names of the killers and abusers, they will pay a big price. I have canceled all meetings with the Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops. Help is on its way. MEGA, make Iran great again. President Donald J. Trump." So this post, of course, comes in the context of all of the Iranian protests that have been going down for about the last week in major Iranian cities, including Tehran. And these protests have been used by the Western media to try and create a context and a pretext for U.S. intervention in the war, as well as Israeli intervention in the war. And we'll get into some of the details of the actual reports in just a bit, because it's really impossible to actually trust any of the mainstream outlets reporting on this. It's really almost impossible to trust anybody's reporting on this, given that, number one, there is an actual internet blackout in Iran, so it's very difficult for real information to get out of Iran. And also, people from all different interest groups on all sides of this are co-opting what we do have for information and videos and footage to try and go to their own benefit and lobby for one outcome or another. Specifically, the people that are pro-intervention here are really trying to use this footage and put it out everywhere on X, on Instagram, and try and lobby the people in the administration to intervene. And they're really bolstering a lot of the numbers as well. We'll get into all this later on in the episode, because I want to spend some time on that, because the Western media's attempts to co-opt these protests is really insane. But first, I do want to focus on giving some background to a lot of these protests, because if you just started paying attention this week to these Iranian protests, it comes completely out of context to you. You don't really have a background as how we got here. And it's important to discuss that these protests don't just come out of nowhere. And the attempts to use them to bolster a U.S. intervention absolutely do not come out of nowhere. And we're going to really zone in on the efforts over the past 30 years largely from both the Israelis and the Likud party in Israel, as well as the neoconservatives in the United States, to try and get the presidents of the United States to go forward with a regime change effort against Iran for decades. So, as I just laid out there's been this long-standing policy in the United States and in Israel to try and to eventually overthrow the Iranian regime, destabilize the regime, largely because, pretty much entirely because it benefits Israel. Because Israel, over, again, that last 30-year timeline, largely with the help of the United States, has lobbied the United States into assisting them in overthrowing regimes across the region, but from Syria to Libya to Iraq, in an effort to destabilize the entire region. And this has been openly acknowledged since really like the 80s within the Likud party, which is the right-wing party in Israel that's led by Benjamin Netanyahu. This has been openly discussed. And if you go back and read some of the neocon writings, which were written to Benjamin Netanyahu at the time, back in 1996, but they're called The Clean Break and Coping with Crumbling States, and they're assessing the current Middle East landscape and giving Benjamin Netanyahu a kind of a plan here from the neoconservative perspective as to how Israel can capture regional dominance and destabilize all the other regimes. And they come up with a plan that's pretty consistent throughout all of their writings, which is overthrow Iraq, start in Iraq, overthrow Saddam Hussein, then move on to Syria and overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, this Ba'athist regime that's propped up by the Iranians, and then eventually, once those two regimes are out of the picture, move forward with a regime change in Iran, and that will complete the timeline. Now, of course, there are other projects in between all three of those major ones. We saw the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. We've seen the bombing campaigns against the Houthis and against Hezbollah in Lebanon. But the main picture was to try and overthrow the major power players in the Middle East that were hostile towards Israel so that Israel can, number one, not make peace with the Palestinians and move forward with their expansion into Gaza and the West Bank without any pressure from outside Arab leaders. And number two, to maintain or at least to create some regional dominance and create greater Israel, which has been the project of people like Benjamin Netanyahu, Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir for decades at this point, and they've all made this explicitly clear. Now, over the course of this entire 25-ish year project, the United States has sold this operation across the Middle East to the American people with this line that we're doing this to liberate the people of all these countries from their authoritarian, oppressive regimes and install democracies throughout the region. As Netanyahu himself said in his testimony in front of Congress when he was lobbying for an invasion of Iraq, he said democracy would sweep the region. We'd be greeted as liberators. This was the sell to the American people to justify the trillions of dollars that were spent on these wars, as well as the countless American young men that were sent to go fight in these wars. That was the justification, but that was never really the actual reason for these wars. In these wars, which were planned almost, like really decades before they even happened, were really concoctions of the neoconservatives who believed that for the benefit of Israel, we would want to overthrow these regimes. That was the main reason that these wars occurred. But they always do involve this pretext. For example, we said that Assad was gassing his own people. We said that Gaddafi was going to go genocidal. We create this idea that these leaders are the newest Hitlerian figures of the world. They're going to go genocidal on their people. And for that reason, the U.S. must intervene on behalf of the people of the world and overthrow these oppressive regimes. That's the same exact storyline that we're seeing right now with Iran. We're told in the Western media that these protests are completely natural uprisings of people who are facing an oppressive regime. And now, due to these uprisings, the regime is fighting back and mowing indiscriminately into crowds of people, mowing them down. And we'll get into this in a bit, but the Western media is really bolstering these numbers of people that they're saying are being killed. We have rumors of 20,000 people, according to CBS News' source, which is Barry Weiss's outlet. This is all creating a pretext here for U.S. intervention to justify this humanitarian U.S. intervention into Iran. That's not the story, though. That's not the real reason we would intervene in Iran, and that's not the reason at all that the neoconservatives for the past decades, but many decades, have been advocating for intervention in Iran and in all these other countries. So if we move into the modern times, that's kind of the story of the past 20-something years here with Middle East interventions from the United States. If we move into modern times, let's say the past couple of years, what have we seen out of Iran? We've seen we had in 2018, this modern stage of this kind of Cold War with Iran started really in 2018 when Donald Trump tore up the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, and basically enacted a maximum pressure campaign of sanctions against Iran. And that really has led to the economic destabilization within Iran that has led to these protests we see today. And we saw this just the other day as well, the expansion of this maximum pressure with Donald Trump said he was imposing 25% tariffs on any country that does business with Iran, which is essentially secondary sanctions against people like China or India or Russia, these countries that do business with Iran still. So this maximum pressure campaign is all intending to create a economically unstable situation in Iran, to create dissatisfaction from the Iranian people, leading to them potentially overthrowing their government in a response. That's the entire goal of the sanctions regime. And they all admit this. This is what the advocates for this policy say. We saw Rudy Giuliani a couple months back in a speech, I believe it was a couple months back. I saw this clip the other day where he openly is saying that he's celebrating in front of this crowd of people how the sanctions have destroyed the Iranian currency and the people are starving. Like, it's crazy, really. But this is what they want. They want to starve the people of Iran so they get dissatisfied, or there is some sort of sense of dissatisfaction with the regime, and they move to maybe overthrow their regime, and a revolution can bloom in Iran. That's the goal of these sanctions in Iran. Now, we also have had this whole question of the nuclear situation in Iran. Iran, at this point, what they're engaged in is called nuclear hedging. It's where they are essentially hedging their bets with their region, with Israel, essentially. And they've displayed that they have the knowledge to create a nuclear weapon, and if they felt they needed to, they have the capacity to kind of rush to a bomb. It's the same thing that, for example, Japan has, and these countries that say if they feel threatened, they will potentially rush towards a bomb. That's what Iran is engaged in and was engaged in back in June when we launched the 12-day war against their nuclear sites, Natanz and Fordow. And that was the justification for that 12-day war, was that we had Benjamin Netanyahu lobbying within the United States and his people in the United States, the Likud party operatives within the United States, the Israel lobby. They were lobbying to Donald Trump that Iran was weeks away, if not days away, from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and we have to act now to take down their nuclear capacity, and that if they had a nuclear weapon, they would use it on the United States and Israel, and we cannot handle this threat. This threat cannot be allowed to continue. That was the sell to Donald Trump to get him to go forward with those Iran strikes back in June. But what you need to understand about the nuclear situation with Iran is that when it comes to selling this continued pressure against Iran, the nuclear factor is just a step one of this greater plan for regime change. Because if we think about countries around the world that have nuclear weapons, we think of like North Korea or Russia or China, all these countries that have nuclear weapons. The reason that these countries, really, if we look at North Korea, it's the best example of this. The reason that someone like North Korea has nuclear weapons right now, like Kim Jong-un, the reason we can't mess with Kim Jong-un necessarily, the reason we can't do what we did to Kim Jong-un, the reason we can't do what we did to Maduro and just kidnap him to Kim Jong-un is because he has a whole fleet of nuclear weapons aimed at South Korea, Japan, Hawaii. We cannot just do that. And that is why regimes get nuclear weapons. It's because the regimes that have nuclear weapons are the ones that cannot be messed with. They can't be overthrown as easily. So the reason Iran is engaged in this hedging right now, the nuclear hedging, is they're saying, don't mess with the regime and we won't need a nuke. If you bomb us, we may rush towards a nuke. If the regime feels destabilized, or if they feel like they are on the verge of collapsing, if they feel actually threatened by Israel or by the United States, that is when the Iranian regime would rush towards a nuclear weapon. And that is why Israel was so excited when Donald Trump announced his bombing campaigns against Natanz and Fordow and these nuclear sites in Iran. Because if we can guarantee, this is Israel's thinking, if Israel can get away from the nuclear threat from Iran, if they can make it impossible, if they can destabilize the regime so much that they are, number one, destabilized from their own people, and number two, cannot acquire a nuclear weapon, that leaves the door towards regime change open. And they can play this long game, which they have for the United States for decades. They played this long game of lobbying U.S. presidents, and they've successfully lobbied Donald Trump better than any other president in history, to have this maximum pressure against the Iranians, to try and destabilize the Iranian regime, make it so that they cannot acquire a nuclear weapon, and that leaves the door open so that when the time is right, they can go forward with a regime change operation against Iran. That is the long game from Israel's perspective. Now, if we fast forward from June and the 12-day war to December 29th of this year, what happened? Or of 2025. We had Benjamin Netanyahu on December 29th come and meet Donald Trump in America for the fifth time in the first year of the Trump term. On December 29th, he went down to Mar-a-Lago and had a long meeting with Donald Trump. And according to all the reports about that meeting was mainly focused on Iran. Netanyahu was supposedly trying to lobby Trump to either bless an Israeli strike on Iran or, preferably for Netanyahu, to get the United States on board with more strikes on Iran, a new round of strikes on Iran. And conveniently, a week after that meeting is over, we have all of these protests in Iran. And this is the game they're trying to play now, because the propaganda, they're really trying to tiptoe around here with the propaganda, because back in June, for the 12-day war, the line was that Iran was weeks away from a nuclear weapon, and that's the main reason for this strike. It was a nuclear threat. But that wasn't Israel's main goal with those strikes. Their main goal overall, with all of these Iranian strikes that have happened over time, is to destabilize the regime, create internal chaos, and eventually, in this long game situation, create a scenario where eventually there is a window for a regime change operation in Iran. This is the Israelis' long game. So we saw in the 12-day war, near the end in the last couple days, they were striking regime targets as the United States had bombed the nuclear facilities and was precisely focused on Natanz and Fordo. Israel was engaged in bombing IRGC buildings. They were engaged in trying to assassinate the top military commanders and these nuclear scientists. They were engaged in hitting regime targets, because that's what Israel's interests are, is to see this regime destabilized and eventually overthrown. So now, with Donald Trump for months having his whole explanation of the war in Iran, the 12-day war, has been that now the nuclear threat from Iran is over. There is no longer a nuclear threat. We got rid of it swiftly, one strike. There's no longer a threat of nuclear enrichment from Iran. So, unless we're going to contradict ourselves, we can't really say now, in January, that the threat from Iran is nuclear, because then Donald Trump would have to admit, which he doesn't want to do, that that strike back in June didn't wipe out the nuclear capabilities of Iran completely. He doesn't want to admit that because he spent months in the aftermath saying that that was it. It was over. The nuclear threat is over. So now the line you hear from Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump at this press conference, like in between meetings, the line is now that Iran is not allowed to have ballistic missiles. This is the line. For those who maybe aren't too aware, ballistic missiles from Iran cannot even reach Europe, never mind the United States. So this is entirely a threat to Israel. This is not a threat to Iran, or this is not a threat to the United States. So there's no way of saying, like, even with the nuclear threat, it was not a threat to America. They do not have missiles capable of bringing a nuclear warhead to America. But if we're even talking about ballistic missiles, there were all the Israeli media outlets have been pumping out reports of Iran has built up their ballistic missile arsenal to pre-12-day war levels. And this is now the line that they're saying Iran has crossed the line. They have ballistic missiles. And it's really crazy, because this has never been the justification to go to war. Every country has ballistic missiles, but they're saying Iran is the one country that is not allowed to have ballistic missiles. Now, you'd think in a reasonable situation with rational players that is maybe Israel, if they feel threatened by this ballistic missile arsenal that's been built up by Iran, would go and talk to Iran. Maybe they'd get the people in the region that they bought off, like Qatar or Saudi Arabia, get them together, get the Emirates together, and maybe go meet with Iran and try and come to some conclusion here. But that's not Israel's goal. See, that if that was Israel's goal, they wouldn't have been engaged in this over the last couple decades in having the United States do their bidding in the region by overthrowing and buying off all the leaders. Because Israel's goal is not to have a mutual relationship with Iran. It's not to have not to be able to live together with Iran in the region and have some sort of cooperation. That's not Israel's goal. Israel's goal, as it has been in Syria and Iraq and Libya, is to create these destabilized states, is to create states that are basically caught up in factions, ethnic factions, like we see in Syria, and create tiny little these states that have no real power to stop Israel from achieving its regional goals of expanding their borders into Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria. So that is the goal from the Israeli perspective. Now, the United States, with these protests that we're seeing, has a very different goal from what Israel's is. And Israel is trying to lobby the United States into their goal. See, these protests, and we'll get into it here right now, I do want to read from the CBS News article, which is just hilarious. CBS News is, for those who aren't aware, a couple months back was bought by Larry Ellison, who is a personal friend of Benjamin Netanyahu's. He offered Netanyahu a seat on Oracle's board. he bought CBS News and installed Barry Weiss, basically an Israeli spy in the media, into the position of editor-in-chief of CBS News. And she has, if you look at the reporting about CBS News, it's kind of in shambles right now, but she has drastically changed CBS News and is really doing so on behalf of Israel. And the reporting is very Israel friendly. Here's what CBS News has to say about these Iranian protests. And this is part of the wider, we see this in the New York Times, we saw this in the Washington Post. They're trying to create this vision of the protests that is very disconnected from reality. And this is from CBS News just yesterday. It says, quote, information trickling out of Iran on Tuesday suggests that a crackdown by authorities to end more than 2 weeks of widespread anti-government protests has likely been far more deadly than activists outside the country have reported. With phone lines opening back up for calls from inside the Islamic Republic, 2 sources, including one inside Iran, told CBS News on Tuesday that at least 12,000 and possibly as many as 20,000 people have been killed. British Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper said in Parliament on Tuesday that the UK believed that, quote, may have been 2,000 people killed. There have been more. My fear is that the number may prove to be significantly higher. So CBS News, they don't reveal their sources here. At least they say sources inside Iran that are seemingly anonymous at this point are telling CBS News that could possibly be 20,000 people killed inside of Iran so far. Now, that is very different from this is the reports from the Human Rights Activist News Agency, which is a U.S.-based group that is paid for by the CIA-linked National Endowment for Democracy. These numbers are very different from CBS News numbers. This is this morning. This is from DropSite now. It says, quote, the U.S.-based Human Rights Activist News Agency, Harana, said at least 2,571 people have been killed in the protests, including 2,403 demonstrators and 147 government-affiliated personnel. More than 18,100 people have been detained, the group said. Associated Press said Harana figures have been reliable in the past, but says it cannot be able to independently verify the toll, as Iran's authorities have cut internet and communications access, limiting outside reporting. Harana receives funding from the CIA-linked National Endowment for Democracy. In a broadcast on Tuesday, Iranian state TV acknowledged reports of a high death toll, quoting an official saying, quote, there was a high number of martyrs from different walks of life, including security forces. So this is the situation. These people have no idea what the situation in Iran is. None of us do. And we're being told a very specific narrative about what's going on inside Iran with these protests. Because these people, like CBS News, Barry Weiss, these people, and again, CBS News is now owned by personal friends of Israeli leaders. These media outlets have an interest in seeing Iran's regime overthrown because it benefits Israel. And this media outlet, CBS News, is reporting based on their sources within Iran. We have no idea who those sources are. They're from separate activist groups within Iran, which, who knows, maybe they're funded as well by National Endowment for Democracy. That's where a lot of these sources are coming from. These CIA-linked groups that are most likely working in Iran during these protests. They say it could be 12,000 to 20,000 people killed in these protests. 20,000. And that is, of course, very different from the reports we're still hearing people saying like 500 have been killed. And here we have the U.S.-based Human Rights Activist News Agency, which is also funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, say at least 2,571 people have been killed. So it's anywhere from 2,571 to 20,000, according to Barry Weiss and CBS News. This is like so crazy. These people have no idea the actual truth of it. They're just trying to get any source they can within Iran to prop up this narrative that they want reported, because they have an interest in seeing this regime overthrown. And we're also seeing lines here. You've seen, I believe the New York Times put out this piece yesterday. I believe it was the New York Times. I could be wrong on that, but it was at one of these major news outlets. These people are saying this line repeatedly, that these protests are mostly peaceful protests, while simultaneously, it's like back during the BLM riots in 2020, when CNN had their guy out there saying mostly peaceful as he was standing in front of a big fire. This is exactly the same situation going on with Iran right now. They're saying mostly peaceful protests in Iran. it's not like they're burning down mosques or anything. It's not like they're shooting and lynching these Iranian soldiers. And again, none of this is to say that there haven't been deaths in Iran. None of this is to say that there haven't been unjustified shootings of protesters in Iran. And this isn't to say that the Iranian government, the regime, isn't cracking down brutally on these protesters. They are a brutal regime that is probably cracking down pretty harshly on these protesters. And none of this, again, none of it is to at all. And you see people trying to say that this is what people like me are saying. Of course, none of it is to defend the Iranian regime. I have no interest in defending Iran. I usually have no interest in defending governments as a whole, but I have no interest at all in defending the Iranian government. Like, give me a break. What this is I'm pointing out the fact that the Western media has perfectly curated this narrative, this humanitarian narrative that they're trying to use as a pretext to send in U.S. intervention forces and try and send in some striking campaigns within Iran to destabilize the regime. These news outlets have an interest in seeing this regime overthrown because the people that run the news outlets are friends with Benjamin Netanyahu. So or the people that own the news outlets, I should say. The CBS News, Larry Ellison, is personal friends with Benjamin Netanyahu. So I'm just pointing it out that you should be aware of what you're listening to and what media you're absorbing, because they have a narrative they would like to sell you. Now, back to this mostly peaceful line. This is a piece from The Gray Zone by Max Blumenthal about this is the Western media whitewashes deadly riots in Iran, relying on U.S. government-funded regime change NGOs. This is Max Blumenthal. It says, quote, Western media has ignored a growing trove of video evidence showing terrorist tactics deployed across Iran by protesters described by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch as largely peaceful. Recent videos published both by Iranian state media and anti-government forces reveal public lynchings of unarmed guards, the torching of mosques, arson attacks on municipal buildings, marketplaces, and fire stations, and mobs of armed gunmen opening fire in the heart of Iranian cities. Instead, Western media has focused almost exclusively on violence attributed to the Iranian government. In doing so, they have relied heavily on death counts compiled by Iranian diaspora groups funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, the regime change arm of the U.S. government, and whose board of directors are filled with committed neoconservatives. The National Endowment for Democracy has taken credit for advancing, quote, women, life, and freedom protests, which filled Iranian cities throughout 2023, which also featured gruesome attacks of violence ignored by Western media and human rights NGOs. Today, the NED is far from alone among the intelligence-aligned actors seeking to fuel the chaos inside Iran. This is what's happening. These sources that the media is relying on are openly aligned with the CIA. So again, none of this is to say that there isn't unjustified shooting of protesters in Iran. None of it is to say there isn't a brutal crackdown of dissent within Iran. Of course there is. But it's to say that the sources that are reporting to the media outlets, the sources that are being used by CBS News and the New York Times and Washington Post to create this narrative that they're trying to feed you, the sources are directly from CIA-backed groups like the National Endowment for Democracy and human rights activists in Iran, these NGOs that foment protests all across the world. These are the groups that are giving you the information of 20,000 people killed without any evidence whatsoever to back that up. If you read some of the New York Times stories, it's all this propaganda that is attempting to make you feel emotional and support a U.S. strike. They're saying body bags piled up, it's all the wording of it specifically is curated to make you emotionally want a U.S. strike to go help these protesters. That is not the government's reason for wanting to do this. This is the propaganda arm of the government working right now to try and make you emotionally support that. But that's not at all their concern. There have been body bags piled up across the world in the name of our allies like Saudi Arabia. There are body bags right now piled up in Gaza that the United States, these very people that are now saying they're piled up in Tehran, the United States has funded the piling up of body bags across the world. This is not their concern. So just at least pay attention to who is feeding this information to you. Because the people that are saying 20,000 people killed in Iran are the same people that have ignored the bodies piled up in Gaza for the last 2 years. So just pay attention to that. And the last piece of news I do want to get to here that could be pointing us in the direction of a potential U.S. intervention here is that this morning, according to Fox News, some U.S. military personnel are told to leave the Middle East bases, U.S. officials confirm. And this could point towards the potential of them moving people out because they are in fear of an Iranian retaliation, which would make sense because Iran does have the ability to strike U.S. bases across the region. If you go read some of their old reports even from the neocons themselves, I believe it was the Pentagon at one point, put out a report saying we do not have escalation dominance over Iran if we were to start a war, because they have the ability to touch all of our bases in the region with their missiles. So just something to keep an eye on there. It looks like we both have military buildup in the region, as well as moving out troops from potential danger zones, being U.S. bases across the region. So that is where we will leave it off for today. That's all the latest I can get to you guys involving Iran. We'll, of course, stay updated on this story because it has the potential to be an absolutely massive story that could define the Trump term if we actually went forward with a full-blown regime change effort in Iran, which is, of course, the dream of the neocons and the Likud party. So that's where we'll leave it off for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to go down below and like and subscribe, and also go to my Instagram, X, and Spotify and give all those a follow, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Have a good one.
It is about who we are. It is about what we believe.
They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
The more you tell the truth, the stronger you become.
Mr. Speaker, we're not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic tonight. We're putting coal in the boiler and setting a course for the iceberg.